Dr. Nabet.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's version of Black Health Trust. We're so happy that you chose to be with us today, and we are really honored to have our guest today, Dr. Richard Williams, to help us celebrate Juneteenth Day. And all of the dads on the call, we wish you a happy Father's Day. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our founder, Dr. Randall Maxey.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Black Health Trust. This is a very special day. I get to present to all of you my teacher and my mentor, Dr. Richard Williams, whom I've known since I was a young medical student. I remain his student, and he is a gentleman that I hold in the highest of regards. And this is a special day for our overall theme of resilience, in that we know that as physicians, we stand on the shoulders of many who have come before us. And Dr. Williams will present us with a litany of those historical figures that have made treatment and medicine of the Black African-American community as we know it. Now, we have a limited amount of time, so I cannot read the totality of Dr. Williams' CV, but suffice it to say that he is a professor of medicine at UCLA, the Geffen School of Medicine. He is a member of and fellow of the American College of Cardiology. He is a fellow of the College of Physicians. He holds an honorary DSc, Doctor of Science, who I know very few people other than Claude Bernard and other people like that hold that type of degree. He was a graduate of Harvard undergrad school, a graduate of medical school at Downstate University. And he also is a graduate of Brigham and Women's Hospital, where he did his cardiology. And he is one of the most celebrated physicians that we have in the entire National Medical Association. And our topic today is, what do we know about Black health? And I'm asking Dr. Richard Williams to please help us lead our discussion on what do we know about Black health. Dr. Richard Allen Williams.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Maxey. Can everybody hear me and see me well?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walks. It's a pleasure to be here on this Father's Day. I just want to mention a couple of other things among my credentials. One is that I'm president and CEO of the Minority Health Institute. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And also that I'm the 117th president, past president of the National Medical Association. And those are two very important posts that I've held, which have given me a great deal of satisfaction in regards to being able to intervene on behalf of our people of color. So today, my purpose is to give you a presentation which will resonate with the time period that we're observing. Today is not only Father's Day, and by the way, I wish not only all of the fathers a happy Father's Day, but also all of the single moms who serve as fathers, really. And we need to wish them a happy Father's Day too, because they've certainly stepped in and done the job that the missing father has not been able to do. The other thing is to observe a couple of other important milestones. What I might consider I consider a negative milestone, and that is we're at 101st anniversary, a few days removed from it, of the Greenwood Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which occurred in 1921. We'll say more about that later, but suffice it to mention that that was the biggest and worst race massacre. It wasn't a riot because Black people didn't have a chance in American history. And people tend to forget about it. It occurred a little over 100 years ago, and at least 300 Black people lost their lives in what was then called Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We should never forget that, because that was an important point in our history. The second thing is that we're observing Juneteenth, which is the day that Black people celebrated emancipation. Emancipation was initially declared in 1862, and the Civil War, of course, ended in 1865. But the Emancipation Proclamation news did not reach all parts of the United States. And in fact, it wasn't until 2 years later that it reached Texas. And it was on June 19th of that year that the Emancipation Proclamation finally arrived, and Black people celebrated freedom for the first time. So with no further ado, I'd like to get into my presentation today, which will focus on the things that Dr. Maxey mentioned, that is what we know or don't know about Black health. I'm not going to be able to give a very thoroughgoing presentation. This will be sort of an overview, and I'm going to focus on something that you need to know more about, and I'm going to try to break it down. It's called health equity, and it has to do with our suffering from racism in medicine and the lack of equitable delivery of health care across the population spectrum. So I'd like the first slide, if I could. Okay. This is the title, formal title of my talk: Historical, Clinical, and Sociocultural Perspectives in Medicine. Focus on achieving health equity for Blacks or African Americans and other underrepresented minorities, or URM. Next slide, please. Well, Dr. Maxey's already gone through some of these accolades that I have, so I won't spend any more time on them. But I want to point to a couple of things in particular, and that is that I wrote a book almost 50 years ago, which was called The Textbook of Black-Related Diseases, which detailed a lot of the medical problems of Blacks or African Americans that we're going to be touching on briefly today. That book has been very impactful from the standpoint of pointing out that one size does not fit all, that diagnosis and treatment might need to be addressed differently for different populations in our society, and that specifically Black people have some health problems which are not necessarily shared in the same way by whites and others in our society. That book has become a part of the Smithsonian Institution, the National African American Museum that we all know about in Washington, and I'm very proud of that. The second book that I've recently written is called Blacks in Medicine, and it contains a great deal of information that I'll be presenting today from not only the clinical standpoint, but the socio-cultural standpoint as well. Next slide, please. Keep going. Now, if you can stop here, this is kind of a philosophical type of departure. These are two Chinese characters, and I've been a student of the Chinese language, the Mandarin language, for years. And it's very interesting that in Chinese, the word for crisis, which we pronounce Weiji, is interpreted as a combination of both danger and opportunity. And I call your attention to that because of the fact that at the present time, we're involved in several crises, especially the pandemic, but also the racism and social injustice crises, et cetera. And what this indicates is that even though a crisis may occur, even though there may be danger incorporated in that crisis, there's also an opportunity that is presented to correct the mistakes that are uncovered, or you might say unmasked, by the crisis, such, for instance, as in the case of the pandemic, which is unmasking a great deal of inequities health-wise for us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next, please. I'm not going to spend much time on my personal history or my personal journey. Suffice it to say that, as is true of many of us, including Dr. Maxey and Dr. Barbara Nabit-Stevens and Dr. Ivan Walks, many of us who are African American and have been involved in healthcare, we've faced certain obstacles that we fortunately have been able to overcome. And we want all of you to know that our very existence at this point, the fact that we're still around and doing what we can to advance healthcare, is really kind of a miracle and a testimonial to the great fortitude that many of us have had to develop in trying to go through all of the obstructions and over the obstructions and so forth that have faced us. Next, please. Well, just a historical departure. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on history, but as it is said, you need to know your history if you expect to be able to make any advances. And so I want to make sure that everybody is familiar with our history as Blacks. And that starts actually back 5,000 years ago. The gentleman on my left, who is depicted in a statue, is Imhotep. He was an Egyptian doctor, really, whose name was the first one known in the history of the world as a physician. That was 5,000 years ago. And you should not forget that, no matter what you hear about others who are touted as being the father of medicine or whatever. This gentleman, this Black gentleman from Egypt, was the originator. And not only was he a great physician who was the first to observe the circulation of the blood and the beating of the heart, and also wrote the first textbook of medicine, which was later depicted as the Ebers Papyrus, and a number of other accomplishments. He was the person that many other historians of note have pointed to as the originator, the father of medicine. So although there are many other medical, or rather historical departures in ancient history, I can't go into many more, but I did want to point out to you that Imhotep is the person that you need to recognize as the father of us all in all of our medicine. Next, please. So now we jump to something that comes considerably forward and has had an impact on us. This is a cut from a book which was written by a gentleman back in the 17th century. And he decided to categorize humans into different categories, looking at humans as not being homogeneous in regards to origins or genetics. They didn't know anything about genes at that time, but they looked at the physical characteristics and decided that there were a number of differences which needed to be recognized. The reason I'm calling attention to this is that this Caucasian gentleman decided that he would rank order these various groups according to their physical characteristics and their mental characteristics as well. And as you might imagine, Homo sapiens included Caucasians and Ethiopians and so on and so forth. The ones who were at the top of the order were the Caucasians, and at the bottom, as you might imagine, were the Africans or Ethiopians. And so it has been over the centuries and decades since he originated this. So this is one of the things that we're currently dealing with, because this is what was taught in medical schools and institutions of higher learning, and is still to some extent recognized. Keep going, please. Well, I'm going to jump considerably forward to what I call the intermediate history and give you some indication of the ravages of slavery and the origins of what we now call healthcare disparities. This is something that started actually with slavery. Slavery began about 401 or 2 years ago, and in the United States at least. This picture here depicts Dr. J. Marion Sims, who was called the father of American gynecology, examining a slave girl kneeling on a table in full exposure to the public as he went about doing experimentations on her, and without any concern about her modesty or whatever, the pain that he was inflicting upon her. He was an absolute monster. And this gives an indication of the kind of treatment, you might say, that slaves were given. There's much more that I could say about that. I don't have time, but this is a prime indicator of the lack of real concern that whites had for blacks, even though blacks were valuable commodities to the slave owners. Next, please. Also, it's important to bear in mind that in our intermediate history, we developed our own medical capabilities and made an intent to try to take care of ourselves because of the fact that our treatment was so bad at the hands of whites. And there arose a number of Black practitioners, not that many, but a few, and I'm going to give you their names in just a moment, but they were able to practice medicine not only among Blacks, but to some extent among whites, and brought a degree of respectability to Black medical knowledge and practice. The gentleman on the right in a military uniform is Dr. Martin Robinson Delaney, who was the first person to attend Harvard Medical School. And the reason I point to him is that when he attended in 1850, it was just for a period of about a year because he was thrown out of Harvard Medical School simply due to the fact that his white classmates refused to continue to study with him. And there were 3 others that had been admitted as well, 3 other Blacks. So they were all thrown out, and he had to continue his medical training under preceptorship. It eventually became a major in the U.S. Army very successfully. Next slide, please. You'll see the names of some of the, I'm sorry, you'll see the two first Black medical institutions, major medical institutions that were formed during the Reconstruction period after slavery ended. And that was Howard University College of Medicine, which was incorporated in 1868, and Meharry Medical College in 1872. Lots of stories about that, but in any event, up through 1910, about 14 Black medical schools had been formed. They were not to last, though, because of the fact that there was a commission that was formed to examine the medical schools in the country at that time. And despite the fact that all of these schools had produced a number of Black medical graduates who were treating Black patients as they needed, all but two of those schools were eliminated. And those two schools are Howard and Meharry. Since that time, three other schools have been added, they being Morehouse School of Medicine, Drew University, and what am I forgetting? I guess that's it. All right, so continue on. These are the earliest Black doctors and slave doctors in America. I can't go through all of them in intimate detail, but I do want to point to the ones on the right. These are the so-called slave doctors. These are doctors who didn't have degrees or even formal training in medicine, but they carried out, so to speak, folk medicine very successfully. I want to point to one person whose name is at the top, Onesimus. He was a slave in Boston in the 1700s. Yes, in Boston, he was a slave. And his master, Cotton Mather, who was a physician, was faced with a smallpox epidemic in Boston. He asked Onesimus if he and his people in Africa had faced this dilemma before and how they treated it. Onesimus showed Cotton Mather how they extracted some pus from these lesions of smallpox, and actually it was cowpox at that time, and inserted it under the skin. And he made a recommendation that the same thing should be done in Boston to the victims of smallpox, and also to perhaps prevent infection with smallpox. They did it, and they did it successfully. The epidemic was put down, and people's lives were saved. So this gentleman was, even though he's not credited with it, was the inventor of vaccination and inoculation, far before Thomas Jenner was, who was credited with it in England. Next, please. So it gives you some ideas of what we tried to do to take care of our own health. And we continued to do that as we moved forward. In 1847, the AMA, or the American Medical Association, was formed, but it did not allow Blacks to become members, Black physicians. And Black physicians tolerated that isolation until 1895, when we formed our own medical association, which, as you know, is the National Medical Association, or the NMA. This is a picture of the NMA convention in Boston, Massachusetts in 1909. It wasn't very big at that time, but it was mighty and carried forth. And today we're celebrating about the 127th year of the existence of the NMA. So we took over for ourselves and created Black medical autonomy. So I'm telling you all these things to give you an idea of what we have done to try to get through the ravages of slavery and post-slavery Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and all of these things that have been leveled against us and have been made life difficult simply to lead. Next slide, please. Well, there have been a number of Black physicians, as I indicated, who have been very prominent in our history. This is one who is depicted in my book, The Textbook of Black-Related Diseases. If you can raise that up a little bit more, you'll be able to see at the bottom of the slide. This is Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who actually did the first operation on the living human heart in history in 1893. He wasn't credited with that in the medical texts that are written by whites, but he's certainly credited for that in the books that I and Dr. Cobb and some of the others have written. He also started the first Black hospital in the United States, owned by Blacks, and that was Providence Hospital in Chicago, where he operated. Next, please. This is another great Black physician, Professor William Augustus Hinton at Harvard Medical School, who wrote the first book on the treatment of syphilis and developed a successful test for syphilis. Next, please. And of course, there's Dr. W. Montague Cobb, who was the major historian of Blacks in medicine, but much more than that. He was also the person who held the Imhotep conferences at the White House for 7 straight years in order to try to bring about the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act very successfully. Not enough can be said about Dr. W. Montague Cobb. He was absolutely one of our heroes, and I consider him one of my mentors. I learned a great deal from him. Next, please. And then, of course, there's Dr. Charles Richard Drew, who essentially invented blood plasma, or at least the use of blood plasma during the war, which saved thousands of lives. Next, please. Now, I'm going to finish up now with giving you a kind of a composite of what I consider 17 critical events in Black medical history. That was creation of the AMA, which I mentioned in 1847. There was the Dred Scott decision in 1857, the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the Civil War, the adoption of the 14th Amendment, which gave Negroes full citizenship, extremely important, creation of the NMA in 1895, Plessy versus the Ferguson Supreme Court decision on separate but equal in 1896, the Flexner Report in 1910. I mentioned to you that that report was responsible for the elimination of all but 2 Black medical schools in this country. Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Civil Rights Act in 1964, affirmative action, which initiated in 1968, the creation of NIH, National Institutes of Health, in 1972, founding of the Association of Black Cardiologists in 1974, the Malone-Heckler Report on unequal treatment in 1985, the IOM report in 2003, and the passage of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, the ACA, the Obamacare Act in 2010. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm about to conclude my presentation, formal presentation. just want to mention to you that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was very concerned about healthcare disparities. And he said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhumane. End of my slides. Keep going. Keep rolling. Keep rolling. Okay. Stop right here because I just want to mention that there are a number of people who and organizations who've been concerned about the discrimination and segregation and bias that occurs in medicine. And I've been very encouraged by the fact that my institution, my alma mater at Harvard, has gotten very deeply involved in this. And you can see that this cover from Harvard Medicine Journal shows the skin, which it says is the body's largest organ, which deflects danger, heralds disease, and captures sensory stimuli. And in this pandemic, its color might mean the difference between life and death. And I just want to go to that now, very briefly, to talk about how that, what meaning that has. Keep rolling. Okay. There's been, as we all know, a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. And this is a very striking statistic, which you need to focus on. In 2020, more Black Americans died of COVID-19 than succumbed to diabetes, strokes, accidents, or pneumonia. That's alarming. In fact, COVID-19 was at that particular time had risen to being the third leading cause of death for African Americans, and it still is. So I want you to keep that in mind in emphasizing the importance of COVID on us and what the difference it makes as to whether you're in a community of color or a white community. Next, please. Keep going. I like always to throw this in to make sure that we are all on the same page, literally, that Black lives do matter. Keep going. And now I want to give you very briefly the definitions of what I call health equity and compare that to health equality. So health equity is a state in which health outcomes and healthcare costs are not determined by race, ethnicity, gender, geographic location, or socioeconomic status. They're not, and they should not be determined by those things. But too often they are. Achieving it requires removing discriminatory and institutional barriers, including factors internal to the healthcare system, such as racism and sexism, as well as external factors, such as poverty and other socioeconomic determinants of health. And so I want to focus particularly on that because this is what we should be all about. We can't achieve health equity, however, until we eliminate racism, systemic racism from our healthcare system. And one of the reasons, by the way, that many people are opposed to even considering that term, systemic racism, is because that term, many people may not know this, was invented by Stokely Carmichael back in 1972. He was the first person to use it. He invented it and invoked it in regards to the discriminatory practices that were going on in regards to healthcare and other institutional systems at that time. Keep going. We're just about finished. I'm going to go by these. Keep rolling. So in order to improve healthcare, and especially its quality, we now have what we call scholastically 5 aims. The quintuple aim is improving population health, enhancing the care and experience, reducing costs, eliminating physician burnout, and advancing health equity. And we've already talked about number 5 to some extent. Next, please. And I want to finally make sure that anybody who is interested in the business world or involved in it understands that there is a business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what we call DEI, that it makes good business sense for commercial outfits for industrial outfits to emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion. And many are these days. I'm a consultant for several companies now, which have established actually divisions to try to invoke DEI in their companies. And many of these are worldwide institutions, such as Ernst & Young and BDO. There are several of them which are now doing that. They're stepping up to the plate to try to invoke these, and they recognize that it's in their financial best interest, their economic interest to do so. So that's where I think the difference is going to be made. We can talk all we want to about how important it is from the standpoint of morality, et cetera, and the best thing for our country, and we need to do right by people. That's not going to work until people see that it's important to their financial best interests, business-wise, to put these things into practice. And that applies to hospitals and medical institutions as well. So I want to end now by opening it up to any questions that people might have. Hopefully there will be some. I know that we've covered quite a few complex issues, but I'm sure that on this day in particular, all of this should resonate with you, that we have an interest, or should have an interest, in eliminating racism, not only from healthcare, but from all aspects of life in this country. And we can do that if we all work together and we all keep in mind that the pandemic has opened our eyes to possibilities, that this crisis gives us the opportunity, as I indicated earlier, to eliminate racism and move on to a more equitable standard of healthcare delivery. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Allen Williams. And I will start the question. I'm going to put you in a situation where you're being offered and receiving the Nobel Prize in healthcare.
I wish.
And in your speech, you're going to tell us 3 of the most important messages you would like to tell communities of color and leave as your legacy.
Well, certainly one important message is that we should not allow anybody else to define who we are. We need to take charge of our own destiny. And part of that has to do with identifying ourselves as to whom we see ourselves as, rather than how somebody else sees us. That's extremely important. So that means making sure that we draw our own identities. The second thing is not to be fooled by anybody else into thinking that these things that are coming up now are not real and are not of great concern. There is a term which is called gaslighting. I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but gaslighting, Ivan, I bet you know what it is. It indicates, and it's an abusive practice in which I guess a controlling population tries to convince a population that it is attempting to control, that there is no real danger from what it is facing, and that they need to just sit back and relax and let time roll by and so forth, and everything will be okay. But obviously, that's not the way that things should go. But keep in mind what gaslighting is, and don't let them gaslight you. The third thing that I would say, and I'm sorry that these responses are so long, but I'm trying to give sufficient detail, is that we have to recognize something that I call the white world's big lie, and that is that we don't need to be concerned about racism. What is racism? It's certainly something that has gone away. Yeah, there have been bad things that have occurred in the past, but we need to get by that. We don't need to even teach people what has happened in the past. As I indicated at the top of the program, if you don't know your history, you're destined to repeat it. Something that I think Santayana said many years ago. So we need to make certain that especially our youngsters know the history of what we have gone through, so that they can prevent a repetition of that for future generations. So those are the three things. I'm sorry again for the detail that I think should be addressed.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Dr. Neighbor Stevens.
Thank you, Dr. Maxey and Dr. Williams. I try not to be a cynic, and I try not to lose hope. And I use as my self-help mechanism the memory and try to imagine what our ancestors overcame and put that in, I put that to what we're going through, so that I can feel that we can continue to make progress. Because I do think we have made progress. But the problem is what lies ahead of us seems so overwhelming that it's easy to give up hope. And the obstacles that are yet to be overcome are so high that they can be very frustrating. So as you look forward to our immediate and not so immediate future, can you give us 3 things that you think we as a people and health professionals in particular need to address and overcome in order to reach this state of health equity and health equality?
Well, thank you, Dr. Barbara Neighbor Stevens. It seems like the number 3 is very important for us addressing today, but I can understand that. The first thing that we need to be concerned about is simply surviving. And that if we don't survive, it's all over. And that's been really a battle. And let me indicate to you how much of a battle it's been. In the 1800s, there was a statistician and demographer named Hoffman, who actually was hired by the Prudential Insurance Company to do a survey of the slave population, the Black population of the United States. And he did that survey, came back indicating that the health problems of Black people were so bad that it would be a miracle if the Black race survived past the year 2000. Now, that was a prediction made by a scientific scientific surveyor And obviously, we have survived, but there's a lesson in how we were able to survive. That lesson is in our resilience. Dr. Maxey's used that term resilience in the title for this program. And I want to come right back to that, because have we not had the resilience, the fortitude, to resist what was almost inevitable, we wouldn't be here now. So survival is the first principle that I want to toss out. We have to know how to survive, how to live. The second thing is how we are going to survive, what we need to do to bring that about. And that means that we have to make certain that we're working together, not at cross purposes, and also that we get sufficient help from others. We're not strong and potent enough to ensure our own survival. And in fact, there are many people who don't want us to survive, as you know, who want to kill us off. And so we have to invent ways of making certain that we do keep on doing the survival thing, that we fight things off, and we're attempting to do that in various ways, which I can't go into thoroughly. The third thing is that we need to invent some means through, again, help from others that will ensure that racism is eliminated, which would, again, encourage survival. And I'll give you an example of how that is occurring and can occur, which will resonate with your feelings of optimism that things may eventually be okay. In 2021, there was a situation that developed in Boston, Massachusetts, with the Mass General Brigham Hospital complex. They decided through some instigation from particular members who were dead set against continuation of racism in hospitals, and Harvard controls 20 hospitals. They initiated what they called a consortium of hospitals, which is called United Against Racism. And this was a very thoroughgoing thing, which was not just a matter of a lot of words being tossed around, but deeds being created. And this is what we need. This is my third principle. We need people to step up to the plate with actions, as they did in Boston, by creating this United Against Racism thing, which drew together 20 hospitals, which is still continuing. They receive $50 million in funding every year to carry out activities in those hospitals which will defeat racism, such as changing the teaching curriculum, making sure that the doctors who are being taught in those systems are not teaching things that are racistly instigated or encouraged. And also just making certain that there's a higher standard of healthcare delivery throughout that hospital system. $50 million a year. And they're trying to pass this on to other hospitals throughout the country. There are two encouraging signs there. One is that Dr. Bob Higgins, who is the new president of Brigham and Women's Hospital, he's a brother, is determined to carry this further outside of the Mass General Brigham system. And he and I have had some deep conversations about how this can be done. So I know that this is a long answer to the question that you're asking, but I want to encourage you that there are things that are occurring. There's much more that I could tell you about, but time does not permit. But we need to keep pressing, and through programs like the Black Health Trust and all the things that we are all doing, and particularly with Dr. Maxey's leadership and your leadership and Dr. Walks and others in the system, we will prevail. We just have to keep pushing on. We can't let things, these negative things that keep occurring, discourage us, and just look at those as things that God has intended to keep pushing us to get to the promised land.
Thank you again. Dr. Walks?
Dr. Williams, I'm just sitting here smiling at you, man. I love what you bring so much. And thank you for everything that you've said and for the answer that you just gave. It is so often, I struggle with trying to draw that straight line from what has happened in the past and what we're doing now. Because so often we talk about, oh, well, you know, the people back then did this and the people back then did that. And we need to have that line drawn all the way to this $50 million. What I wanted to really ask you, where did that $50 million come from? Is that part of the multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar Harvard endowment? And maybe, is that part of how what you talked about earlier, the business case for this? People seem to think that somehow if they treat us bad and keep us sick, that it's okay, but it's costing them money. And you articulated that so well earlier, that I want to know, when we think about these kinds of efforts, is it coming from money saved by doing right, or is it coming from trying to change the overall system so that we can do right and save the money?
Very wonderful, Dr. Walks, and thank you for the compliments on that. The money comes from a number of sources. A lot of it is anonymously donated, but much of it comes from industry. There are people or companies in industry which do see the need to make donations, contributions to efforts like this. And in the Boston case, the Harvard case, that is largely the situation. And they're getting the money. They've got people, I mean, look out, this is Harvard. They've got the largest endowment in the world, but then they don't want to use that money that they've got, you know, in the till to do something like this. So what they do is that they draw in all these folks that they know and they're in their catchment to make these donations. And this can be done by others. I mean, this is the richest country in the world, and everything operates based on money and health policy and so forth. And so if people of goodwill can be convinced to put their money up, then things will happen. And that's happening more and more. I indicated to you that Ernst & Young, which is one of the largest companies in the world, financial or economic companies, has created a very large division, particularly to deal with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to eliminate racism. And one of the people that many of us know, Dr. Yale Aluko, is heading that up. And he and I have had conversations. They're spreading this throughout the country. It's working. And so just stay tuned on that. Last thing that I want to mention about the Harvard situation is that there's even more that's coming about. A new institution that has started, it started actually about 5 years ago. It's called the Lown Institute. Dr. Bernard Lown, who was one of my mentors at Harvard Medical School, died recently at the age of 100 after achieving the Nobel Peace Prize and a number of other things. He invented the cardiac defibrillator, but most importantly, he was a humanist and someone who wanted to make certain that right things were being done in medicine. So this institute was started particularly to try to focus on equity in healthcare in hospitals. And they are changing the paradigm in regards to how hospitals operate, how they're rated. And, those ratings make a difference. If you're rated number one in the world or in the United States in hospital care, you get a lot of perks that other hospitals don't get. Well, they're turning the tables, and it turns out that some of the highest 10 highest ranked hospitals are at the bottom from the standpoint of equity and diversity and healthcare delivery. And that's making a difference from the standpoint of how they're being regarded. And they're standing up and taking note and saying, hey, we need to change the way we're operating. That's the way things need to be done. And that's going to get action and have traction.
Thank you. This is the picture I have in my mind is that the youngest of our moderators amongst us is looking up at I'll call you elder statesman. Dr. Hines, you have questions for Dr. Williams.
I do. Thank you again for the presentation. I truly enjoy learning more history and facts of things to celebrate about being African-American and having that legacy. It's interesting. I did not grow up celebrating Juneteenth. I'm from Maryland. I was aware of it, but it wasn't necessarily something that we celebrated per se until I was probably in high school. And one of my friends, their family's from Texas, and they celebrated Juneteenth all the time. And I was like, this is interesting. So my question then to you is around your thoughts on what, if any, do you think is the value of having Juneteenth recognized as a federal holiday, especially in the context of systemic racism? In the information that you brought just forward about Harvard changing its educational principles and stuff like that to be more inclusive, since the early 1900s, the percentage of Black doctors has not changed, right? So that's the kind of thing, what the example that you brought is the kind of thing that hopefully could make some type of difference. So I'm just curious on your thoughts on the recognition of Juneteenth.
Well, the first thing that I want to mention is that we've talked about a number of things on this program today, and there's so many more things that we could point out. The main thing to keep in mind is that all of the things that we're discussing are linked. There is a common thread that runs through them, which has to do with racism. That's the most important thing for us to point out today. That is the common thread. No matter what ingredient that you point to today, whether it's a matter of talking about Juneteenth, or whether it was Greenwood massacre, or whether we're talking about healthcare delivery, racism is the common denominator that cuts through everything and what we must eliminate. So to answer your question specifically, it's not just a matter of pointing to what the significance of Juneteenth might be from a historical standpoint, or what we might expect to get out of celebrating it in the future for future generations. The most important thing is to link it all together, with all of the things that have happened in our entire history. And the reason that I wanted to give you that historical perspective was to draw together all of those things so that you can see how connected these things are, and how we have to have a total concept of things that are facing us as a people. We can't focus on just one thing. If we do, we're going to get defeated. We have to have a much broader perspective, more comprehensive perspective, is if we're going to defeat this thing. And it all starts with defeating racism.
The takeaway that I have, Dr. Williams, from your talk, and I was trying to find a logo or a slogan But we know that in World War II, a whole Holocaust was around the Jews who were murdered by the Nazis. And they developed a slogan of never again. Now we're hearing people say that they do not want critical race theory. They don't want the 1819 project. They don't want to realize that Greenwood was actually destroyed. They want us to forget that people were trying to kill us and almost did. How can we make sure that we never let anybody forget that we lost multiple millions of people on the Middle Passage, that we're losing people now to gun violence? We need to make sure that we do not let people ignore the tragedies that we have suffered, and we're not going to take it anymore. How can we go about that in a way that befits us? And I know I've got younger children who are adults now, but they haven't seen what we've gone through and what we had to do to get where we are. They see us now, we may drive a little Mercedes, or in your case, a Bentley, but how do we keep our people focused on where we've come from and why it is so important that we never let people forget that?
Wow, that's a powerful question. And again, I'm going to try to link that back to what Dr. Hines was asking about and what Dr. Barbara Neighbor-Stevens brought up, and pull it all together, hopefully very briefly. Dr. Ivan Walks knows what I mean when I say we need to deal with this with a Gestalt psychology. That means that we need to look at it as an overall approach, something that will give us an opportunity to address several things in one fell swoop. That's not easily done. But when we look at our purpose, our mission, which is to make certain that we continue to survive and that we get the message to our younger generations of what has happened, we are encouraged. The best way to do that is through education, and we're being challenged in regards to doing that by the attack on critical race theory, et cetera, which hasn't even been put into place. It's scaring people, white people, to death that we are going to know more about what has happened to us. But we have to push on. That is our mission. And what you're doing with the Black Health Trust helps with that. This is something that is a duty of all of us. You are doing something that is fantastic from the standpoint of educating our youngsters and our current generations about what's going on. If people don't know, they're going to continue to be victimized. And as was said, what's past is prologue. What has happened in the past definitely will be repeated, especially bad things, unless we do things to prevent that. And keep in mind that the pandemic, in my opinion, occurred, the COVID pandemic has occurred for the purpose of unmasking all of these things that have been flying below the radar that they want to keep below the radar. It's making America take notice of the terrible things that have been done to Black population all these years, centuries, and that this is a time of reckoning. This is saying if you don't deal with it now, everything is going to be destroyed. And I'll finally end up by invoking kind of a biblical type of expression from James Baldwin, our famous departed author. When he looked at the social scene many years ago and realized that folks in positions of power were not really addressing things the way that they should be. In other words, They were being unethical, they were being brutal. All of the social injustices that were occurring were not being corrected, etc. He said, "Okay, now, folks, God has told you about this before. Remember that we had a situation in the past where the flood came and everybody, or almost everybody, was wiped out by the water. And I just must tell you that uh, in the terms of what God might say, you need to keep this in mind. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time." And so keep that in mind. People are being alerted to the fact that God is not playing. He's looking down on the situation and saying, I've given you an opportunity to correct all these inequities and so forth, and you've not done it. If you don't do it this time, it's all over.
Hmm.
Keep that in mind.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. This has been great. I'd like you to stay around for a few minutes. We need to discuss just a few other things. Simon, can you go?
Dr. Maxey, before you move too far away, Dr. Jordan has been politely holding his hand up for a long time. And, you know, the pastor in church this morning said, lift your hands in praise, but not too high, because you can't hold them up for a long time if you lift them too high. So I just want to acknowledge Dr. Jordan's been holding his hand up pretty high for a while now.
Okay, and from a historical standpoint, we especially need to recognize Dr. Jordan, who also came from the Harvard system with Dr. Williams. Dr. Jordan?
Good afternoon.
Good
I just
afternoon.
want to share something. When I was a freshman, and hello, Richard, I was called out of my Spanish exam. My mother had developed a bleeding duodenal ulcer. They'd taken her to every hospital in Little Rock, no beds for a colored female, took her across the river to North Little Rock, 40 miles north to Conway, back through Little Rock, 45 miles south to Pine Bluff, no beds for a colored female. They were bringing her back home to put her in the bed to bleed to death. And she wanted to hear my voice before she died. And the ambulance driver just felt so overcome that when I got to the phone, all I heard him saying to my stepfather was, "Nigga, you stay here. I'm gonna take her in as a white female because she's very fair-skinned." So for the next 3 days, she was in the University of Arkansas Hospital passing. But I think what a lot of us don't understand, I was born at home. Most people, my generation, and up to Richard's, if we were born down south, you were born at home. Black women weren't allowed to have babies in hospitals. So the history that we need to let people know is very detailed. But I think when you look at how many people were born in Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas, many died because they were in a home, they were home. And if it was a breech birth, Lord help us. I met my midwife before she passed, but that was the situation. I think we need to sometimes just spend some time really trying to get an idea of what health was like, period, because our ancestors went through hell. I cannot think of any other way of describing it. There were times that if white folks drove by your house and they wanted to come in and take your food, rape your mama, do whatever, they could do it, and that wasn't considered anything. So things are a lot better. But when we talk about getting people to change, we got to get the folks who are, quote, in power to change also. And I mean, that's the important thing, because that's their norm now. So thank you.
Thank you. And Ivan, we don't want to get away from this. I just want to bring some other things up that Dr. Williams and you guys can comment on.
Dr. Maxey, I'm just trying to keep you out of trouble. So just keep in mind that Dr. Sherrod has had her hand up for a while, but you go ahead and then we can work everybody in.
Okay, good. Simon, go to the top of the slide deck. I want to go to the slide that talks about the vaccines. So we've talked before and been concerned about the long COVID syndrome. And we know that it has many of the symptoms of the acute illness, including cardiovascular problems, coagulation problems, gastrointestinal problems, kidney, mental health problems, and metabolic problems. Go to the next slide. We know that compared to unvaccinated patients with SARS, that having the vaccine gives you a 34% lower risk of death, but only a 15% lower risk of long COVID. So this is saying it definitely lowers your risk of death, but it doesn't as significantly lower the incidence of long haul COVID. So this means that we cannot just depend on vaccination alone to prevent that potential loss of cognition that can happen with long COVID. Next slide. So what this does say, that vaccination alone cannot protect us. So this is like a shield that doesn't totally work. So vaccinations are important. Next slide. But it's very important that we prevent initial infection in the first place, or if you've been infected, that we try to prevent you from being reinfected. We've talked for quite a few months on common sense. So we believe that it's still important to practice masking when you're around other people who might be infected, that you protect yourself to reduce the risk of exposure and improvement. It is not a time to just say it's over. Just because you can get on planes doesn't mean you shouldn't protect yourself. We still have to continue to protect ourselves and use common sense. And with that, I want to open the floor back up to our co-moderators and any members of our advisory. And let's start with Dr. Sherrod. Can you make sure Dr. Sherrod is open? You can take the
Yeah,
floor.
thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Maxey. And I just want to thank Dr. Williams for that excellent presentation. And, you know, it's an honor to be a mentee of Dr. Williams. I'm one of his mentees. And Richard, I didn't really get to hear the whole lecture today because I was dealing with a medical emergency, but I've heard you do that lecture before, and I know you've added to it. My question is, isn't the simple question, and it's not simple, but isn't the underlying question, how do we deconstruct structural racism when it comes to health equity and racism and the whole shebang? Is how do we go about deconstructing structural racism? And I wanted to add to what Dr. Jordan was talking about. You know, I grew up in Mississippi, and my mother had 11 children, and all of them were born at home. I was delivered by a midwife. So that was quite prevalent, even in my generation. I think I may be a generation behind you, Dr. Jordan. So healthcare is a major issue, but the educational part is also a major issue. And now we have strong efforts in the United States to try to prevent us from actually knowing the history of what happened. And I think that is a major, major challenge because education is the key to beginning to eradicate almost anything. You need to know what you're doing. You need to know what happened. And so I really commend Dr. Williams for continuously reminding us of the historical aspects of our being and our existence. And I'm just hoping that we can take the baton and carry it forward. The younger people like Dr. Joycelyn Hines and others who are much younger than I am, that we can carry this information forward because it's very important in us being able to deconstruct structural racism, which is what we're faced with. Now, according to the one comment on the long COVID thing, and I think Dr. Jordan alluded to this one other time in our earlier sessions, is that you can also get long COVID from the vaccine. And there was an announcement on ABC Channel 7 this past week. They dealt with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and the challenge of deciding whether to take the vaccine in the face of chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. And we had one lady who actually took the vaccine and had long COVID from the vaccine for 10 months. So you can, and you just need to be aware of that. But her take on that was that her risk of dying from COVID was greater than the long COVID that she got from getting the vaccine. So both the vaccine and the infection can give you long COVID. And I just had an encounter with a healthcare provider yesterday who said that she was seeing primarily a lot of patients with long COVID, and the major symptom that she was seeing was fatigue and cardiac problems like palpitations and irregular heartbeat.
Dr. Sherrod,
Yes.
you know I love you.
Yeah.
I have not heard that the vaccine can cause any kind of COVID, whether it's long or short COVID. And so I think that in keeping with how Dr. Maxey does things, when we are going to give that kind of information, it needs to come through the medical advisory so that it can be vetted with the rest of the medical advisory. Certainly myself, as the head of the Black Health Trust Vaccine Committee, I would like to have that information in advance so that it can be vetted before we announce it on Sunday. So I am not debating what you're saying, other than to say that I personally have not heard and don't know any other physicians that have heard and confirmed that the vaccine causes any sort of COVID, long, immediate, short, or anything else. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear. And I welcome the conversation that you're approaching for us to have that on the medical advisory, not today. Is that all right?
And
Oh yeah, that's fine. I'm just telling you, it was on ABC 7 News.
Dr. Sharon, hold on just a moment.
Yeah.
First of all, I back 100% of what Dr. Walks is saying. Let's get Dr. Williams to address your question about how do we unstructure structural racism. And also from an intellectual standpoint, we do know that since the mRNA virus is a vaccine is not a live agent, not a decelerated agent. You cannot do that, but we'll have that discussion on our next advisory meeting. Dr. Williams, would you address her question regarding deconstructing structural racism? I like that, Dr. Sherrod.
Right. I think that there are three possible approaches about trying to deconstruct racism. The first approach is something that a lot of people would like, other people would like to see happen, and that is do nothing. The second approach would be to try to tear down the existing structure, medical structure system. And the third would be to completely build a completely new structure, medical structure. Now, the first one is not to be tolerated. We're not going to sit still and let things continue as they have been. The second approach, that is to tear down the existing system, is unconscionable. There's no way that we're going to be able to tear down the system that has existed. The third approach, that is constructing a new system, is also not tenable. So what we need to do is to try to do something rational and reasonable, and that is work within the existing structure as though it is a parallel universe, and try to come out with something that is much better than the status quo. And that is exactly what is happening, as I mentioned, in the Mass General Brigham system. They are taking what they recognize now as a failed system based on racism, not failed in regards to clinical terms, because obviously they've been very successful, but failed in regards to equitable healthcare delivery. They're taking that and turning it completely around, turning it around upside down, and they're doing it because of the fact that they have money to do it. And so what I mentioned about their system being restructured, reconstructed, is exactly the answer to your question. I think that that needs to be done all across the country, not only in regards to clinical practice, but in regards to medical education and in regards to preventive medicine, public health, etc.
Well, thank you so much. We're close to the end of our program. We'll see if there's anything else in the chat. But let me make a statement that was started by Dr. Walks. When we put together the Black Health Trust, we initially had a number of people who would talk about everything from 5G to conspiracy theories. And we amongst ourselves said, we want to present vetted information that we could count on to give to people in communities of color. Those of us who follow medical literature know that there are 1,000 articles that come out a day, some of which are pure horsepucky. We decided that we would evaluate what the CDC said, what the National Medical Association said, what the FDA said, and those sources of information that we believed were credible were the ones that we would present in our Sunday forums, ones that we could have confidence in, that looked like they were well-researched. And if we found something different, we would bring that to the table. In the meantime, we have a medical advisory meeting that we haven't had for quite a few weeks on Wednesdays, in which there are no rules except you can bring it to the table and we can discuss things that may not be vetted. But on our Sunday program, which is aimed at the lay audience, it is not an academic discussion of concepts, but rather an informational thing that we can agree upon is the best information possible. And we vet it. So we respect all of the physicians and advisors that are on our program, including Dr. Sherrod and others, but we must insist that if it's not vetted, if we haven't discussed it and agreed upon it on our Wednesday meetings, that that's not what we're going to present on Sunday. And we appreciate all of our physicians and experts and medical advisors helping us keep this going. We must present information that we consider vetted. There's nothing that we cannot talk about on our Wednesday meetings. The floor is open to those. But as we come to the point where our program is over, I'd like to ask our medical advisor. If there's any comments, I'd like to ask Dr. Stevens, Dr. Walks, Dr. Hines, and Dr. Williams, of course, to have final words as we start to transition to the rest of our Father's Day. Dr. Williams.
No, wait, Dr. Maxey. We can't give Dr. Williams his final word yet because there's something I have to throw in, and I really want Dr. Williams to address this. Okay. First of all, Dr. Williams accused me of knowing what gaslighting meant. So I thought I did, but I figured I better go back and look it up. So Dr. Williams, here's why that is so important. And this is another reason why we love the brilliance that Dr. Williams brings, because gaslighting and understanding that term when it gets thrown around is massively important. Let me just say this. Gaslighting is an emotionally abusive strategy that causes someone to question their feelings, thoughts, and sanity.
Right.
How important is that? How important is it that we understand that when people in the media toss this term out, oh, they're just gaslighting. Gaslighting is something that is abusive. It's a strategy.
That sounds like Governor DeSantis.
Well, it sounds like a lot of people, and it's meant for us to question our sanity, and we can't do that. So I appreciate Dr. Williams bringing something like that to us and giving us a chance to think about it. Let me get to something else real quick, though real quick ain't my strong suit, but let me get to this real quick. We talk a lot about the importance of what's happening with Black health. And I just want to point out that this is not the Black only health trust. Part of our history is how critically important other communities have been to our struggle. And I just wanted to point that out. I don't know what the world would have looked like for us today if non-Black people weren't abolitionists and didn't want us to get rid of slavery. I don't know what civil rights would have looked like if Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, hadn't had strong allies in the Jewish community. It's well documented that when we come together, two things we find out. Everybody who's with us ain't for us, and a lot of the people who don't look like us can be our strongest allies and our partners in our human race. So, Dr. Williams, I just wanted you to just respond to that piece about how important it is for us to allow people to show us who they are and recognize that our help, our support, and our encouragement doesn't have to look like us.
There's no question about it, Dr. Walks, and thanks for that. I'll try to be equally brief. First of all, as far as the gaslighting is concerned, that's something that has its origins in slavery, really. And it was brought to my attention by my old friend, Dr. Alvin Poussant, one of your fellow psychiatrists.
Yes.
And he talked about a philosophy which was called Drepdomania.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that originated with slaveholders. To be very brief about it, the slaveholders wanted to try to convince the slaves that if they thought about trying to run away, that not only was a bad idea, but it was insane, an indication that their mind, there was something wrong with their minds. And that was where the term Drepdomania came from. And so there was a physician in New Orleans called Samuel Cartwright, who informed the slaveholders that they could appeal to this medical decision to get their slaves returned to them by claiming that the slaves were crazy, that they had Dreptomania. And so it has an origin, the gaslighting term has an origin in slavery. To address your second issue that you brought up about making certain that we recognize that all of our friends who are going to be supporting us are not necessarily members of our community, may not have the same skin color or whatever. That is absolutely true. In fact, if you go back through history, you'll find that there are many times when people from other communities, other philosophies, and so forth have come to our assistance. And that includes the setup of the Reconstruction, what was happening during Reconstruction in regards to the construction of medical facilities for Blacks. That was something that was begun by a white congressman from Pennsylvania who just on his own decided that Black people were not going to be able to survive without being able to have some facilities of their own that they could run and take care of themselves. And so he went to Congress and fought for the construction of these facilities, the land grant institutions and so forth. Things like that, that we don't know about, that other people have helped us with. We could not have possibly done that ourselves. So your point is well taken. We need to make certain that we recognize that all of our help, the help that we need, is not going to come from within our own resources.
Are there anything in the chat we need to deal with, Dr. Neighbor Stephen?
No, there are no questions in the chat.
Dr. Maxey, before you sign off, I want to give you a little piece of information that might be materially helpful to the Black Health Trust. I've mentioned a lot about Harvard's involvement and coming to terms with its involvement, or even one might say complicity, in slavery. In the last, about 2 months ago, the president of Harvard, Dr. Lawrence Bacow, came out with a report which is called Harvard's Legacy of Slavery. It was a report that was generated actually by the Black dean at Harvard, this lady who is just fantastic. She created it over a 2-year period, did the research that showed how complicit Harvard was in slavery, such as having 4 presidents of Harvard who were slave owners themselves, and a number of other things that indicated their complicity in slavery. The upshot of all of this is the production of this fantastic report, which I encourage you to read, not because you need to know a lot about Harvard or whatever, but because you need to know what can be done to come to reckoning within an institution to try to eliminate racism as best you can. And that's what they're doing. They not only produced the report, but based on that report and their determination to try to do everything they can to eliminate racism, they have pledged $100 million to make certain that institutions and organizations that are trying to do that are able to get grant funds to do so. So the reason I'm bringing this up at this time is that I think the Black Health Trust would be a perfect applicant for those kinds of funds. Those funds are intended to try to encourage organizations and movements such as yours to get some money to help with the expenses, keeping the lights on and doing what you need to advance and so forth. So keep that in mind. You can go online and look up the Harvard Slavery Legacy, and you'll see all the details, including the money that is being pledged to organizations like this.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. You've been so valuable in your brilliance in what you brought us today. We certainly appreciate you. And if Dr. Walks gives me permission, I'd like you to have last words, even though you've had last words. Is it okay, Dr. Walks?
Absolutely.
Well, excuse me, Dr. Walks and Dr. Maxey, if I may.
Sure.
Okay. I just want to add my thanks to Dr. Richard Allen Williams, whose name, if we stop and just take a note of his name, Richard Allen Williams. Now think about that for a nanosecond. And for us to teach that to young folks, because that's really what the future is. I believe in that children are indeed our future, not to be trite. And the only way we can really help to put the show on the road is to instigate, advocate, and propagate a proper education. For instance, in his list of 17 critical events in Black medical history, he mentioned the Institute of Medicine and National Institute of Health in the same breath as what I think it was Dred Scott, Affordable Care Act, Voting Rights Act, and those monumentous acts. And I was struck by that, and that I believe I think he talked about that a bit when he spoke of the deconstruction of racism. But since we're out of time, I understand that, I recognize that, but I happen to have at the heart of my own personal philosophy, commitment to identity, direction, and purpose. And it's impossible to have either one of them, never mind all three, if we don't get a good handle on who we happen to be. So, Dr. Williams, if you could just square that peg for me and help me out with the NIH and IOM being mentioned in those 17 criticals, I would really, really appreciate that, sir.
Well, I'll try to be simple again with that. Let me start with NIH. The National Institutes of Health was organized and instituted in 1972. We never before that had any organized effort or institution to pull together all of the facets of science, research, and medicine under one umbrella. And that was important. And there was a Black initiative that really helped to give rise to that. Very simply, it was sickle cell anemia. At that time, the sickle cell was not being addressed directly. And there were a lot of people that were complaining about it. I'm sure that Dr. Barbara Neighbert-Stevens knows about the history of all of this and could teach us a great deal about that as well. But you should know that sickle cell was not being addressed. Black people were dying and in great pain all the time, and nobody was doing anything about it, especially the government. And guess who came to address that, to bring attention to the President of the United States, who was Richard Nixon at that time? It was the Black Panthers. The Panthers went to war almost on behalf of the victims of sickle cell and said to the president that we're going to riot in the streets unless you do something about these people who are suffering, our people. Richard Nixon, to his credit, and also recognizing that, I guess you might say, the fear component, decided that he would address this by passing a revolutionary statute at that time. It was called the Sickle Cell Relief Act of 1972, along with creating NIH and the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, all of which helped Black people. And that's the reason that I put that in there, because we've gotten a great deal of traction from the organization of NIH. As far as the IOM is concerned, the Institute of Medicine was is where the healthcare disparities were initially addressed in total. In fact, that was where healthcare disparities were originally defined. That was in 2002. And the Institution of Medicine which is called the National Academy of Medicine, took it upon themselves to look at what was called unequal treatment of people, which had been brought up in the report that had been issued in 1985 by Malone and Heckler. And what they did was to come out with a report which addressed 20 different issues of what were eventually called healthcare disparities, and indicated that something definitive needed to be done to address it, to eliminate racism. And they addressed it as racism as the cause. Over the ensuing 20 some years, since that time, 20 years, nothing substantial has been done. And this has been pointed out by a number of pundits who have studied this. And so that now we're addressing this as a moment of reckoning, where after the federal government itself has declared that healthcare disparities are a cancer on our society and need to be removed, and that racism needs to be removed, we need to take some action. And so that's where we are with those two things, NIH and the IOM.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Richard Allen Williams. And also, I'm curious to know if you think that there is room to approach the likes of Ernst & Young and BDO and very large firms and get them on board with the whole idea of promoting education of young Black people, Black education, Black medical education, so that way we can fortify the pipelines to medical schools and nursing schools and pharmacy schools and such.
Well, Dr. Gibson, you're very, very clairvoyant and very, very, I mean, I'm just astounded. I shouldn't be because of your reputation, but I mean that anybody should suggest something like this based on what I mentioned. You are right on target. And I would suggest that that the Black Health Trust should invite Ernst & Young, and particularly Dr. Yele Aluko, to come on the show and talk to everybody about what they're doing and what their intentions are to eliminate racism. And you will be astounded at what you're going to hear.
Is that Aluko or Ayuko?
Aluko.
Aluko, okay.
Aluko.
Okay,
He's a Nigerian extraction.
great, got it.
So
Thank you, sir.
So much. Thank you so much. Dr. Barbara Neighbors-Stevens, how are you?
My cup is full, and I have been, as all of us, I'm sure, have been observing or watching some of the specials that are being put on for Juneteenth. It occurred to me, not only with what is produced for Juneteenth, but also what is produced for so-called Black History Month, that we're getting good information. Don't get me wrong, good information, but it's very disjointed and episodic, and that we need to do everything we can. And I'm not waiting for somebody else to do this. This is something we have to do ourselves. Pull information together whenever we can. So my last comments, I want to challenge those. Now, people who were born in the South should know this, but I will challenge those who are not born in the South to know what the significance of Watch Night is.
Mm.
The reason that I'm bringing up Watch Night is because we need to know the full context of Juneteenth. So Juneteenth, we're observing, as has been stated, because of the late arrival of the information to Galveston, Texas. But you should wonder, what did the rest of the former slaves do, or how did they find out about the Emancipation Proclamation? So what happened was, the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an executive order, was issued in September, but it was not to go into effect until midnight of December 31st. And therefore, the then slaves all over the South, and as Dr. Williams has noted, there were some in other places as well, gathered the evening of 12/31, New Year's Eve, to wait to see what was going to happen at the stroke of midnight when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Now, there was jubilation and celebration, but there was also trepidation because folks who lived in the South knew that the white man was not going to go down without a fight. And so there was trepidation around this, but that is the origin of the watch night custom that is still observed in many places in the South. My church still does it. So I just wanted to let my last words be a contribution to the overall wealth of knowledge of our culture and our history.
Wonderful. And keep in mind, Dr. Nabrit Stevens, and I'm sure you know it, the slaves could not really gather together without trepidation because of the fact that there was actually a law against more than four Black people gathering together at one time. Otherwise, they would be arrested. So they were very fearful for their lives, even though they wanted to celebrate and have jubilation.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. Dr. Ivan Walks, my friend.
Dr. Maxey, you know I have talked too much today already. Just a thank you to Dr. Williams. What the only correct word for it is, what a blessing. What a blessing to have access to this kind of intelligence and this kind of commitment to continuing to educate us. So thank you.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Hines, you've been labeled as the person that we got to pass this baton to. With all these old guys around you, we're so glad to have you with us. But do you have any final words?
I do, and it's along those same lines, actually. On this Father's Day, in that same vein, my thoughts are, if you haven't shared your personal stories with your people, right? With your kids, with your grandkids, share it. And if your audience isn't ready to hear it for whatever reason, right? Video it, write it down. Because part of, I think, not just, understanding your history as Black people and in an external way is in an internal way, knowing about what your own dads, uncles, fathers, what your own family's been through. I think there's so much value in those personal experiences. So I think on Father's Day, in addition to the ties and the grilling and the tools and all the rest of that stuff, share your stories.
Thank you so much. I wish everybody on this call a very happy Father's Day. And for some of us, a very happy Grandfather's Day. I guess that's sort of official. And thank you, Dr. Williams, for being so astute in bringing us our history. This has been an honor. And I really love being your mentee all of these years. And that's for true and serious. Have a good day, everybody. Enjoy your Father's Day and Grandfather's Day.
Good day,
Thank you,
everyone.
Doctor. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.